My name is Claire, and I am 32 years old. I restore old books for a living, which means I spend most of my days in a climate-controlled room at the university library, carefully peeling apart pages that haven't been touched in a century, breathing in the particular smell of aged paper and leather bindings. It's precise, solitary, unhurried work. My colleagues joke that I have the patience of a saint and the personality of someone who would rather talk to a dead author than a living one, and honestly, they're not entirely wrong. I like order. I like things that last. I like knowing that what I'm holding in my hands is real, documented, permanent. Maybe that's why what happened with my father's property hit me so hard. And maybe that's also exactly why I was the one person in my family who was truly, completely prepared for it. Before I get into any of this, I want to take a second to connect with you. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. It genuinely amazes me how far these stories travel, and I love knowing you're out there. The call came on a Wednesday morning in October, while I was in the middle of repairing a 19th century botanical atlas, my tweezers hovering over a page so brittle it was almost translucent. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, and the name on the screen was one I hadn't seen in almost 2 years. It was my father's attorney, a man named Gerald Howell, who had handled my father's affairs for over a decade and who had the unhurried, deliberate manner of someone who had delivered hard news so many times that he had perfected the art of being gentle about it. He told me my father had passed away in his sleep the night before. Heart failure. He had been ill for several months, though the timeline was shorter than any of us had expected. My father, Douglas, was a woodworker. Not in a hobbyist sense, but in the truest, deepest sense of the word. He had spent 40 years building custom furniture by hand in his workshop on a 3-acre property in the foothills of western North Carolina, just outside a small town called Brevard. The house was a 2-story craftsman bungalow he had renovated himself over the course of a decade, and the workshop behind it was a serious, beautiful structure, insulated and wired properly, with 16-foot ceilings and 2 industrial dust collectors and walls lined with every kind of hand tool imaginable, organized with the same loving precision that I brought to my own work. The property backed up against a stretch of woods that was always fragrant with cedar and pine. Growing up, every summer I spent there felt like a world entirely separate from ordinary life. My parents had divorced when I was 4. My mother raised me in Ohio. My father remarried when I was 7, a woman named Pamela, who came with a son of her own named Derek, who was 3 years older than me. I had never been close to either of them. Pamela was pleasant enough in a surface way, the kind of pleasant that has a hard limit and a subtext. Derek was the kind of person who made every room slightly smaller just by walking into it. When my father's health began to decline, I had made the trip to Brevard 4 times in the last year, sometimes staying for 2 weeks at a stretch, helping him organize the workshop, sitting with him on the porch in the evenings while he talked about the pieces he wished he'd had time to finish. Those visits were some of the most important of my life. My relationship with my father had been complicated by distance and by years of his marriage to Pamela, but in those final months, we had found our way back to something honest and true. He told me things I hadn't known. He apologized for things I'd stopped expecting him to apologize for, and in one of our last long conversations on that porch, he looked at me with eyes that were tired but completely clear and said, "Everything here is yours when I'm gone, Claire. I need you to know that. And I need you to be smart about protecting it, because you know how Pamela is. You've always known." I knew. Gerald Howell told me to come to his office on Friday. The will was unambiguous, he said. The property, the workshop, the tools, the inventory of finished pieces, all of it had been left to me. Pamela had been provided for separately through a life insurance policy and a fixed financial account, as she was legally entitled to as a spouse, but the property itself, the physical place that had been my father's life's work, was mine. I drove to Brevard in a haze of grief, arriving the evening before the meeting. My stepmother and Derek were already there when I pulled up, which I had expected. Pamela met me at the door with red eyes and a tissue clutched in her hand, and her hug lasted a second and a half before she stepped back and looked at me with an expression I had seen on her face before. It was the expression of someone doing a careful calculation, Derek stood in the doorway behind her with his hands in his pockets, watching me the way a man watches something he intends to pick up and examine more closely the moment no one is looking. "It's good you're here," Pamela said. "We have so much to figure out together." Together. The word landed like a stone in still water. That evening was a quiet, guarded thing. We ate takeout at my father's kitchen table, and every attempt at real conversation slid sideways into practical talk about arrangements and timelines and what would need to be done with the property. Derek made a comment about the real estate market in Western North Carolina being absolutely on fire right now, and then looked at me with a practiced, casual expression as if he'd just observed the weather. Pamela said, twice, that the property was really more than one person could manage, especially someone who didn't live locally, especially someone in a competitive professional field who needed to stay focused. She said it with warmth and concern in her voice, and both times I told her I appreciated the thought and said nothing more. Gerald Howell's office was on Main Street in Brevard, above a jewelry store, up a narrow flight of stairs that creaked on every step. He was a man in his late 60s with a white mustache and a slow, courteous manner, and he had clearly done this enough times that he knew to keep a box of tissues on the corner of his desk. He walked us through the will methodically and without drama. It was exactly as he had described on the phone. The property, in its entirety, was left to me. Pamela was entitled to her insurance payout and her account, both of which were substantial. Derek received nothing, as he had never been legally adopted by my father and was not named anywhere in the document. Pamela's expression during the reading was one of controlled, precise stillness, the kind of stillness that is not peace but its opposite. Derek sat with his jaw set and his eyes moving around the room in small, restless arcs. When Gerald finished, there was a long silence, and then Pamela said, very quietly, "I see." She said nothing else in that office. Neither did Derek. They walked out ahead of me, and I watched them through the window as they stood on the sidewalk below, talking in low voices, not looking at each other, but both looking at the ground, the way people do when they are deciding something. I stayed behind for a moment after they left. Gerald looked at me over his glasses with an expression that was part professional caution and part something warmer, something like concern. "How are you doing, Claire?" he asked. "Honestly," I said, "I'm worried about what comes next." He nodded slowly. "Your father was worried about that too," he said. "He left a letter with me. For you. He asked me to give it to you today, after the reading." He slid an envelope across the desk, my name written on the front in my father's handwriting, the careful, deliberate script of a man who had spent his life working with his hands and chose his movements accordingly. I didn't open it there. I put it in my bag and thanked him, and walked out. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I opened the letter. It was 2 pages, front and back, and I am not going to share all of it because some of it belongs only to me. But the part that matters, the part that changed everything, was near the end of the second page. My father wrote that he knew Pamela and Derek would contest the will or find some other avenue if contesting failed. He knew them. He had watched them for years. He wrote that he had already spoken to Gerald about a specific legal step he wanted me to take as soon as I inherited the property, and that Gerald had the details. He wrote, in the deliberate and unhurried way he approached everything, "Don't fight them out loud, Claire. You know how you work. Quiet, careful, documented. Do what you do. Build something they can't touch, and then let them come." I went back upstairs. Gerald was still at his desk. He looked unsurprised when I walked back in. "The letter?" he said. "The letter," I said. What he explained to me over the next 45 minutes changed everything. My father, through Gerald, had already begun the process of setting up a limited liability company, a single-member LLC registered in North Carolina, specifically designed to hold the property as its sole asset. The idea was this. Once the deed transferred from my father's estate to me personally, I would immediately deed the property again, this time into the LLC. The LLC would become the legal owner of the property. I would be the sole member and manager of the LLC. What this meant in practical terms was that any legal challenge to my personal ownership, any attempt to claim the property, was improperly transferred. Any fraudulent document naming Pamela or Derek as rightful owners would be attacking a corporate entity, not a private individual, with all the additional legal protections and documentation requirements that entailed. It would also mean that any deed transfer away from the LLC would require my signature as manager, recorded formally, in a way that created a clear and auditable paper trail. My father had already paid for the LLC formation. All that remained was for the deed to transfer to me through probate, and then for me to execute the second transfer into the company. Gerald was prepared to move quickly. Given my father's specific instructions and the existing groundwork, the process could be completed within 10 days of the estate clearing probate, which Gerald projected would take approximately 2 weeks given the uncomplicated nature of the will. "Your father was a thorough man," Gerald said. "He made furniture that lasted 100 years, I said. "He understood foundations." I left his office with a clarity that I hadn't expected to feel, not in the middle of grief, not on the second day after losing my father, but it was there. My father had given me more than property. He had given me a plan, and the same part of me that spent its working hours carefully, methodically preserving things against the damage of time and carelessness, knew exactly what to do with a plan like that. Back at the house, Pamela and Derek were in the kitchen when I returned. The atmosphere had shifted slightly since the morning. There was a performative lightness to them, a careful, studied ease, the kind that people adopt when they have already decided on a course of action and are waiting for the right moment to reveal it. My stepmother made coffee and offered me a cup, and Derek sat at the table with his phone face down and his arms crossed in a posture he seemed to think communicated casual relaxation. "We've been talking," Pamela began, wrapping both hands around her mug in a way that was meant to look warm and intimate. "And we just want you to know that we support whatever decision you make about the property. We know it's a lot. We know you have your life in Ohio, your career." "I appreciate that," I said. "We were thinking," Derek said, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone who has rehearsed their lines enough that the rehearsal is showing that it might make sense to at least have the property appraised. "Just to know what you're working with. If you decided to sell, the 3 of us could split the proceeds. It would be fair, given everything." Given everything. I looked at him. I thought about my father's letter, about the phrase, "let them come," and I took a slow breath and said, "I'll think about it." That was enough for that night. They seemed satisfied, which told me they had expected more resistance and had braced for an argument they were now surprised not to have. I went to bed early and lay in the dark in the room that had always been mine when I visited, listening to the creek that ran along the edge of the property, and I let myself grieve my father quietly and completely. And then, the way I had trained myself to do in my work, I set the grief aside until there was space for it, and I thought about what came next. The following 2 weeks were a study in patience. I stayed in Brevard, took a remote leave from the university, and worked alongside Gerald as the probate process moved forward. Pamela and Derek remained in the house, which was technically still under the estate during probate, and their behavior during that time followed a predictable escalation pattern. First came the suggestions, gentle and reasonable sounding. Then came the pressure, dressed up as concern. By the end of the first week, my stepmother had started making appointments with a local real estate agent without mentioning it to me, and Derek had started researching the property's commercial rezoning potential, which I discovered when I found a printed summary of zoning regulations on the kitchen counter and a handwritten note on the back in his handwriting that said $890K conservative estimate. I said nothing. I filed the paper in my bag as documentation and said nothing. Gerald moved quickly. The deed transferred to me personally on a Thursday morning. By the following Tuesday, the second deed, transferring ownership from me to the Claire Douglas LLC, had been drawn up, executed, notarized, and filed with the County Register of Deeds. The LLC had a registered agent, an operating agreement, and a bank account. The entire chain of title was clean, documented, and unambiguous. My father's workshop, his bungalow, his 3 acres of Western Carolina hillside, were now the property of a legal entity that I alone controlled, that could not be sold or transferred without my signature as manager, and that was protected by an entirely separate layer of corporate law from anything Pamela or Derek might try to argue in a civil challenge to the will. It was all in place before my stepmother's real estate agent had even sent her first comparative market analysis. I went about my days quietly. I organized my father's workshop, spending hours cataloging his tools, photographing his inventory of finished pieces, going through his order book to identify which commissions were outstanding and which clients needed to be contacted. Being in that workshop was the closest thing to being with him I had left. Every tool had its place, and the places were deliberate, reasoned, the product of a lifetime of thinking about how work flows. I found half-finished chairs and a credenza he had been building for a client in Asheville, and I made a decision, quietly and privately, that I was going to see every one of those pieces through to completion, even if I had to hire someone to do the actual woodworking. He had made promises. I would keep them. Pamela noticed the change in me. Not the LLC, she didn't know about that yet, but the change in my posture, maybe. The way I had stopped hedging when she raised the subject of selling. The way I had started saying, calmly and without apology, the property isn't going to be sold instead of I'll think about it. It made her uncomfortable in a way that began to surface as irritation. One evening at dinner, she said, in a voice like a blade wrapped in flannel, "You know, your father would have wanted us all to be taken care of, Claire. All of us. He was a generous man. He wouldn't have wanted you to be selfish about this. He was generous," I said. "He was also very deliberate." The will reflects both things. She put her fork down and looked at me for a long moment, and I saw it then, the thing my father had described in his letter. The calculation. The reevaluation of strategy. She had thought this was going to be a negotiation, and she was realizing it wasn't. She left the table early that night, and she and Derek spoke for a long time behind the closed door of the guest room. 3 days later, it happened. I was out on the back porch with a cup of coffee at 7 in the morning, watching the mist move through the tree line, when I heard a car pull into the drive. I looked around the corner of the house and watched a man I didn't recognize get out of a sedan and walk up to the front door. He was carrying a manila folder. Pamela answered before he knocked, which told me she had been watching for him. I went inside through the back door and stood in the kitchen, listening. "I have the documents here," the man was saying, his voice low and professionally smooth. "Everything is filed. The transfer is on record. You should be in good standing to proceed." "Excellent," Pamela said. I walked into the front hallway. They both looked up. The man's expression went carefully neutral. Pamela's went from triumphant to something harder to read. Something that was trying to be apologetic and not quite making it. "Claire," she said. "Good morning. This is an associate of ours. We've been working with him on some paperwork." "What paperwork?" I asked. The man looked at Pamela. She looked at me. And then she drew a breath and said the thing that she had been building toward since the morning in Gerald Howell's office, the thing that was supposed to break me. "We've had the property transferred," she said. Her chin was up. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this. "We spoke with our own attorney, and given the circumstances of your father's final years, his cognitive decline, his isolation, there are grounds to challenge the validity of the will under undue influence. Our attorney filed a deed transfer on our behalf as the rightful heirs of record while the challenge is being processed. The property is ours now. Legally. I'm sorry, Claire, but we need you to be out by the end of the week." Undue influence. Cognitive decline. My father, who had written me a 2-page letter in precise, measured handwriting 6 weeks before his death. My father, who had given Gerald Howell detailed, legally specific instructions for a protective LLC filing. My father, who had been the most deliberate human being I had ever known. Derek appeared at the top of the stairs, and I looked up at him, and he looked down at me with an expression that was the sibling of every look he had given me over the years, the one that said he had always been waiting for the moment when I would finally be smaller than him. The anger that moved through me was cold and clean, and underneath it, already rising to the surface, was something else entirely. The memory of standing in Gerald Howell's office on a Tuesday morning, signing my name to a deed that transferred this property not to me personally, but to an LLC, the notary's stamp, the filing confirmation, the county register's date and seal. I looked at Pamela. I looked at the man with the folder. And I did the same thing Ava had done, because it was the only appropriate response to a trap that had already been sprung from the other direction. I smiled. It was small and quiet, and it confused her immediately. "Okay," I said. She blinked. "Okay, I understand," I said. "I'll be out by the weekend." The man with the folder looked at Pamela with a flicker of something uncertain in his professional mask. Derek descended 2 steps and stopped. None of them knew what to do with my composure, because they had scripted for tears or argument, and I had given them neither. "Good," Pamela said finally, and the word came out sounding less triumphant than she had intended. I went to my room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel every molecule of the fury and the grief at once, because I am human, and this was my father's home, and these were the people who had tried to take it from him and now from me. I let myself feel it for exactly 5 minutes, and then I picked up my phone and called Gerald Howell. He answered on the second ring. I explained what had happened. There was a silence on his end that I had learned meant he was thinking very carefully before speaking. "They filed a deed transfer from you personally," he said. That's what he said. "Yes." Another silence. And then, quietly and with great satisfaction, he said, "Claire, they transferred a deed from someone who hasn't owned the property in 2 weeks. You personally haven't been the owner of record since the LLC filing. Whatever they filed is a transfer from a party with no legal standing to convey title. It's void." "I know," I said. "I want to be there when they find out," he said. "I was hoping you'd say that." "They said they're bringing someone by Saturday to do a walkthrough. I'll be there Friday evening," Gerald said, "and I'll bring everything, every document in the chain of title, the LLC formation, the operating agreement, the deed of transfer into the company, the county recording confirmation. And I'm going to want a word with their attorney, because whoever filed that fraudulent deed is going to have a very serious conversation with the state bar." I spent Thursday and Friday in a strange double state, performing the theater of departure while privately dismantling none of what actually mattered. I stacked some boxes in the living room, the ones I had been using to sort my father's books and papers, and I let them be visible, let them serve their purpose as props. I did not take down my father's tools from the workshop walls. I did not pack the sea glass bowl he kept on the kitchen windowsill, a collection of pieces he had gathered from Lake Michigan on a trip he'd taken in his 20s, before he was a father, before he was a husband the first time, when he was just a young man who liked the way light moved through colored glass. I put it on the windowsill and I left it there. Pamela called on Friday morning to confirm the Saturday walkthrough. Her voice was careful and bright, the voice of someone managing a situation they believe is under control. "Just your personal things," she reminded me. "Leave the furnishings, we'll have them assessed." "Of course," I said. Gerald arrived at the house at 5 o'clock Friday evening. He was wearing his good coat and carrying his leather briefcase, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been practicing law for 38 years and has been waiting a long time for the particular satisfaction this particular afternoon was about to provide. We sat at my father's kitchen table, and he walked me through every document one more time, and we talked through exactly how Saturday afternoon was going to go. "Say as little as possible," he told me. "Let me lead. Your job is to stand in your home and be calm." "I can do that," I said. "I know you can," he said. "Your father told me you could. He said you were the most unflappable person he'd ever met in a crisis." I had to look out the window for a moment after that. Saturday came gray and cool, the kind of October morning in the North Carolina mountains that smells like wood smoke and cold leaves. Gerald was already in the living room with his briefcase open on the coffee table when Pamela and Derek arrived at 11, along with the man from earlier in the week and a second person I didn't recognize, a woman in a blazer who turned out to be a real estate agent. They all came through the front door with the brisk, proprietary energy of people who believe they are walking into a situation they own. And then they saw Gerald. Pamela stopped in the doorway. Derek bumped into her from behind. The man with the folder went completely still. Gerald stood up from the armchair with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has never once in his life needed to rush, and he looked at all 4 of them with an expression of perfect professional calm. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Gerald Howell, attorney for the owner of this property. Before we go any further, I think there are a few things we should clarify." "She's being evicted," the man with the folder said, and his voice had lost its practiced smoothness. We have a deed transfer on record. You have a document that purports to transfer title from Claire Douglas as an individual, Gerald said, and he reached into his briefcase and laid a document on the coffee table with the particular deliberateness of someone placing the final piece of a puzzle, and I understand why you might have thought that would be effective. Unfortunately, the deed you filed attempts to transfer property from a party who, at the time of your filing, no longer held title. He laid a second document beside the first. This is the deed of transfer recorded with Henderson County on the 14th of this month, transferring ownership of this property from Claire Douglas as an individual to the Claire Douglas LLC, a single-member limited liability company, of which my client is the sole manager and member. The filing predates yours by 11 days. Claire Douglas, the person, does not own this property. The LLC does. Your deed is a transfer from a null party, which makes it legally void on its face. The real estate agent took a small, deliberate step backward toward the door. The man with the folder looked at Pamela with an expression that was equal parts panic and the particular betrayal of someone who has just realized they were given incomplete information by a client. "That's not possible," Derek said, but his voice had gone thin. "It's not only possible, it's documented," Gerald said. He set a third page on the table. "This is the county recorder's confirmation of filing, time-stamped and sealed. And this," he added, setting down a fourth document, "is the LLC's operating agreement, which specifies that any conveyance of the property requires my client's authorized signature as manager. No such signature was given. No such signature exists on your document." Pamela had not moved from the doorway. She was looking at me now, and her face was doing something complicated and painful, cycling through anger and disbelief and a kind of dawning understanding of what had happened. I held her gaze, and I thought about my father's letter, and the creek, and the sea glass on the windowsill, and I felt, more than anything, enormously tired. "The document you filed with the county," Gerald continued, his voice carrying the cool finality of a man closing a book, "constitutes fraudulent conveyance. The preparation and filing of a falsified deed of transfer is a felony under North Carolina General Statute 14-122. The attorney who prepared this document, and I will be finding out exactly who that was, faces disbarment proceedings. You and your son face potential criminal prosecution, Pamela, including fines and imprisonment." He paused. "I want to be very clear about the seriousness of what has been done here." The man with the folder said, very quietly, "I think I need to make a phone call," and stepped outside. The real estate agent was already at her car. What happened next was not triumphant. It was just the end of something, the way endings usually are, quieter than you expected, and sadder than you wanted. Pamela sat down on my father's couch, which was no longer hers and had never been, and she put her face in her hands. Derek stood by the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and I could see in the set of his shoulders that he was doing what he had always done, which was recalculate. Gerald produced a final set of documents. The agreement was the same kind that comes at the end of things like this: an acknowledgement that their claim was fraudulent and without merit, a full relinquishment of any future interest in the property, and a no-contact provision. In exchange, and because my father had been a generous man whose spirit lived in these walls, and I was trying to honor that, criminal charges would not be pursued if they signed and left. Gerald gave them 20 minutes. Derek signed first, which surprised me, and then didn't. He had always been a man of arithmetic, and the arithmetic here was obvious. Pamela signed second, without looking at me, and when she finally did look up, the expression on her face was not the cold fury I had expected. It was smaller than that. It was the face of someone who had believed, for a very long time, that she was owed something, and had just arrived at the place where that belief finally ran out of road. They left before noon. I watched the car from the porch, the way I had known I would, standing with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold without my noticing. I watched until the car was gone around the bend in the road, and then I listened to the sound of the creek and the wind in the cedar trees, and the absolute particular silence of a place that is yours. Gerald came to stand beside me on the porch. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father would have had thoughts about this. He would have been very precise about those thoughts," I said. Gerald almost smiled. "Call me if you need anything," he said. "I'll be in touch about the fraudulent deed referral to the bar." He drove away and left me alone in the thin autumn light with the house and the workshop and the 3 acres of hillside that my father had poured 40 years of care into, that smelled like cedar and cold air, and every summer I had ever spent there. I went back inside and I put my father's books back on the shelves one by one, running my fingers along the spines, the way I did with the books I repaired at work, reading the history in the textures. I put the sea glass bowl back in the center of the kitchen windowsill, where it caught the afternoon light and threw small patches of color across the counter. Green and brown and pale blue, the colors of a lake in the summer of someone's young life. I went out to the workshop and I stood for a long time in the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, looking at the half-finished credenza on his main work table. That evening, I sat on the back porch until the stars came out, which they do in that part of Carolina in a way that is different from anywhere else I have ever been, brilliant and dense and very close, as if the altitude and the clean air have removed several layers of distance between you and them. The creek was audible below in the dark, steady and indifferent to everything that had happened, the way water always is. I had lost my stepmother and my stepbrother. The truth was that I had lost them long before Saturday, long before my father died, long before the deed and the LLC, and the man with the folder. I had lost them the moment I first understood that some people look at a person and see only an obstacle or an opportunity, and never the person at all. What I had kept was everything that mattered: the house, the workshop, the smell of this place and the light in the mornings, and the sound of the creek. My father's tools hanging in their places on the workshop wall, organized the way he had organized them, the way he had organized his entire life, carefully and purposefully, and with an eye toward making things that last. He had known I would need a foundation. He had helped me build one, not in wood this time, but in paper, in documents, in the quiet and unshakable language of legal fact. He had trusted me to protect what he built, and I would keep doing it, one day at a time, in this place that was mine. I took a breath of the cold October air and I felt, for the first time since the phone had rung on that Wednesday morning, something that was not grief and not anger, but something clear and steady underneath both of them. Something that had been there all along, waiting for the storm to pass. I was home, and I was staying.